All right, so we'd like to welcome all of you guys back to the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and University of Wyoming Extension Sheep and Goat webinar series. We bring this webinar series to you on a monthly basis, so we offer it on the second Wednesday of every month. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Carrie Satterfield, who is an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at Texas A&M University. His research utilizes a number of assisted reproductive technologies to investigate the impact of nutrition during pregnancy on the development and function of the placenta. He's secured over $6.1 million in funding to support this research program, and in 2016, he was recognized by receiving the Early Career Achievement Award in Research from the American Society of Animal Science. In addition, Dr. Satterfield currently teaches Animal Science 333 reproduction in farm animals at Texas A&M and has instructed over 2,300 undergraduate students since being hired at Texas A&M. And today, we are so excited to have him here to talk about successful implementation of AI and embryo transfer programs. So I'm just going to let you take it from here. I'm excited to hear what you've got for us today, and then we will come back together at the end. So take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks, Melinda. I really appreciate the invitation to talk to y'all today. I guess I'm appreciative of the fact that it's sunny and 75 here in Texas, and I understand it's snowing in Idaho, and I wouldn't appreciate that very much. Nonetheless, I'm happy and excited to talk to y'all today. My primary position here at Texas A&M is research, and then I teach the main undergraduate course. So this is a slight change of pace for me because I get to interact mostly with producers, and where I spend a lot of time talking about principles and theory. Today we're going to talk about practice. So I'm looking forward to that, and also answering any questions at the end of the webinar. All right, so this maybe is not the most fun slide to start with when you start to think about applying these assisted reproductive technologies on the farm, right? Because every producer that I ever get to talk to is telling me how the new jump from the new male that they're going to use is going to change their breeding program, or how they just bought this elite donor female on this online sale, and she's going to advance their program, and everybody's excited. And everybody's thinking, oh yeah, this is going to work, right? And so they're excited to do these things. But really the first thing that we need people to understand is there's a lot of risk that goes into these procedures. We are playing with biology, right? We're trying to take the biology that we understand and then augment it in a way that gives us an advantage through the use of these technologies, but things don't always go well, right? There's a lot that we still don't understand. There's a lot of times you may ask a lot of questions this afternoon, and my answer is, I don't know, right? And so these are complex procedures, even though we've been doing them for some time. And so you always need to think about what risks are out there. And then secondarily to that, and this is a question I can't answer, is what is your tolerance for that risk, right? How much risk can you handle in your program to try to move it further, right? Because that's ultimately the goal, right? Is to advance your program, and your program is individualized. Now, the basis for any assisted reproductive technology, whether we're talking about AI or embryo transfer, starts with our estrus synchronization program. And in our small room, and it's fairly straightforward. We use a CEDAR device, right? And these are a progesterone impregnated device. And we use these devices whether we are in season or out of season for bringing these females into heat. Now, what are the advantages of estrus synchronization? Most of them are probably common sense, but we can use them to shorten our breeding season. Certainly when we're talking about these other technologies like AI and embryo transfer, an ultimate goal would be to enhance our genetic progress through management of our superior sires and also our superior dams on the ET side. But one thing that I hear more and more about from producers is how it's helped them at lambing or kidding time, right? We're all really busy. We've all got a lot of things going on, and it's very difficult to lamb or kid effectively 24 hours a day for 4 or 5 months out of the year. And then the way we think about how we market our lambs and kids now, more on these online sales, trying to hit very specific markets. And so having these more uniform lamb crops, kid crops, and having a more focused labor resource at those critical periods is really helping producers. And I hear a lot of benefits about that. And it's something maybe we don't think about as much. And as the value of these offspring, just keep getting higher and higher. I mean, I keep thinking it's going to stop, but it's not stopping, right? Rams and Billies selling for upwards of $100,000, Wethers selling for $10,000, $15,000, being normal almost, sadly. And so with each loss, that's a tremendous loss potentially for the producer. And so this increased focus, this increased labor benefit is very, very important. Now, whether we're doing, or I guess when we think about estrus synchronization beyond the cedar, we have two major options depending upon whether we are breeding in season or out of season. If we are in season, then that means that these ewes or does are naturally cycling, and there's a relatively high probability that they're going to have what's called a corpus luteum on their ovary when we put the cedar in. And the corpus luteum is producing progesterone. So when we go to remove the cedar, which is a secondary progesterone source, we need to get rid of a corpus luteum that might be there on the ovary as well. And so to do that, we would use prostaglandin F2 alpha. And so this is the hormone that destroys the corpus luteum. And you might be familiar with these two, commercially available products. There are others, but ones that you're probably most familiar with are Lutalice or Estrumate. And both of these hormones work well in conjunction with the cedar during the season, okay? If you are out of season and these ewes or does are not cycling, giving a shot of sterile water would be just as effective as giving these two hormones. So it's very important to know and use these hormones appropriately based on the physiological state of where your females are at. So if we're out of season, the most common hormone that you'll see in protocols is a product that's labeled for use in pigs, and that's PG600. Okay, PG600 is a combination of two hormones, human chorionic gonadotropin and pregnant mare serum gonadotropin, or sometimes referred to as ECG. So neither of these hormones are naturally present in our sheep or goats, but they are very effective when given to our sheep and goats in starting a new follicular wave and causing those females to develop a dominant follicle and then release the egg from that follicle for fertilization. So we can use this product very, very effectively out of season. Now, one of the downsides to using PG600, particularly if we want to try to use it in season, because some people do, is there is a side effect, so to speak, of getting an increase in ovulation rate. So more twins, triplets, even quads. Okay. And so a lot of times we're in a position where more lambs is not necessarily what we're after, right? We're in a situation where we need lambs that are healthy and thrive. We don't have to spend a lot of time getting them on a surrogate mom or a milk machine or something like that, because they're just not going to do as well. So in season, a lot of producers will shy away from using PG600 because of that. But regardless, either of these two hormone classes can work very effectively in their correct application. Now, in sheep for sure, and it's growing in goats, fixed time laparoscopic AI with chilled semen is the most common technology that we're currently implementing on the farm, right? And so here we have a ewe that's in estrus, and we invert her in a cradle to allow for her intestines to fall away from her reproductive tract, and then we can physically inject semen straight into the uterine horn. And this is the gold standard technique for either sheep or goats. It is possible to do transcervical AI in goats with a little bit of practice. Their cervix is not nearly as torturous as the sheep cervix, but it still does take a long time. And I see more and more goat producers here in Texas, at least, shifting over to using the laparoscopic approaches. And this is just a generic protocol. You can see a lot of different protocols if you talk to different people, but regardless, most protocols involve inserting a CEDAR, waiting some period of days, a minimum of 7 up to 12. You then remove the CEDAR and give an injection of that prostaglandin or that PG600, depending upon whether you're in season or out of season. Remove the animal from feed and water, and then inseminate a certain number of hours after CEDAR removal. And you'll see here I have, if we use fresh semen, typically insemination is 46 to 48 hours after CEDAR removal. And if we're using frozen semen, it's later than that. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why we're later than that here in a bit. One of the things that I hear a lot of producers ask about is, do I have to check heat? Oh, I don't have a teaser. Do I have to check heat, or should I get a teaser to check heat? And for all of these protocols that we use in small ruminants, they are fixed time, typically speaking, right? You're going to have your technician come out to the farm. Everything's going to be set up to AI at 10 a.m. as example. And so you don't have to check heat. However, that doesn't mean that checking heat couldn't be beneficial for you, right? And so things to think about would be that if you have a low pregnancy rate, if things don't go as well as you think they should have, why, right? Is there something technically that went wrong? And so with the more information that you have, the better you can be in terms of identifying potential problems so that you can eliminate problems in the future. So as example, if you only have 75% of your females actually come into heat in response to your estrus synchronization program, it's unlikely that you're going to get an 80% pregnancy rate. But if you have 98% of your ewes come into heat, then that might be attainable. But if you don't check heat, there's really no way to know, because at the time that the technician is depositing the semen, these females should be getting close to going out of heat, in fact. So that can be helpful. It might also be helpful because one of the things that all of this stuff is based on, it's based on a bell curve of average responses, okay? And so on average, we think about ewes ovulating at a specific time, but it may vary based on breed type, age of the females, climate, body condition, things like that. And so if you have heat records, estrus detection records, that can help you and learn more about your flock. And maybe you want to advance your timing a couple hours or delay your timing a couple hours based on how your females do on your flock. All right, so again, when we're using AI, we think about the advantages of that. Obviously, the largest AI is the enhancement of genetic progress through the use of superior sires. And I'm hate to be the bah humbug guy on this, but at the same time that we can get all of the benefits, we have to recognize that we also get all of the bad things. right? As these genetics get tighter and tighter genetically, we will have more and more issues, whether we're talking about hairy lamb or spider or the dwarfs. You know, that we have plenty of evidence where when we get an increase percentage of these mutations, that we have negative effects. And so that's not to discourage anybody from the technologies, but just understand that you get the bad with the good. One of the things that's happening very quickly, certainly with these new technologies, is it's helping us to identify what are considered the superior sires, right? When you have, you know, ram lambs or buck kids that are siring literally hundreds of offspring in their first lamb crop, if not thousands for some of the more popular ones, you know, that really helps you figure out really fast whether they work or not, whether they're good, and how that might influence your program. Reduce management costs associated with sire maintenance, right? Nobody likes to have a whole bunch of rams standing around. And certainly if we're using AI and we're getting, you know, say 50% of our use settled by AI, then certainly I need fewer rams standing around for cleanup duty. And at the same time, if we think about what elite sires cost today, you know, it's very difficult to have an elite sire that, you know, you'd be comfortable just turning them out on your flock and say, okay, you're good enough, you can breed all of these females. So AI allows us to do that, and then have our cleanup rams to do a smaller number of those females. We already talked a little bit about the intensive herd management and the benefits of that go along with our estrus synchronization. And then obviously, if we're talking about frozen semen, it allows us a tool for the reestablishment of superior genetics from deceased or injured sires. This is probably less of a thing right now, because the industry is changing so fast, right? The show industry, which is the ones who are going to use these technologies, the bloodlines of genetics are changing so quickly. It might be rare that you want to go back and get offspring from a deceased or injured sire, but certainly we have sterility issues from year to year. And there were a lot of sterile rams out there this year, and so even that, the frozen semen can be very helpful. So let's talk about semen, because the biggest factor in success of a breeding program almost always is semen. And so if your objective is to get as many females pregnant as possible, then it's quite clear that using a fresh collection is the best option for that, right? That would be your preferred option, is to have a fresh semen sample that has not been frozen, because it's well established that freezing semen causes sperm to die during the process, and you're going to get lower pregnancy rates. Now that's variable depending upon how well that animal froze, but nonetheless, it will be lower than with a fresh collection. So it's quite common now that we, you know, are collecting rams or bucks with AVs. We then extend that semen sample and can use it fresh on farm, or chill it down in some type of chilling container, and then ship it to other farms, ranches across the United States for insemination the next day. This is very common in equine and swine. They've been doing this forever. The sheep world really heavily adopted this technique about 10 or 15 years ago. And the goat world is coming along more quickly in recent years. Now, what are the risks with this? So there's a risk of transmission of bacteria. So with the laparoscopic AI technique, we are injecting the semen directly into the uterus. We are bypassing the cervix. Well, the primary function of the cervix is to provide a barrier for bacteria so that they cannot get into the uterus. And once the female goes out of estrus, the cervix closes and it contains everything in the uterus, and the uterus is designed to grow things. That's what it's supposed to grow a baby. But if you have a bunch of bacteria in the uterus, it's going to grow that bacteria because it's producing factors that are supportive of cell growth. So while copulation is not a sterile technique or a sterile event, you have to really manage the sterility of this process, using sterile tubes, cleaning, your AVs between each male, cleaning the belly of the ram, doing it on concrete, not on dirt, so you're not getting dust in there. All of those factors that can help to minimize the risk that we deposit semen into the uterus that has bacteria. Because if it does, then the worst thing that's going to happen is those ewes will not cycle. A female that has a uterine infection will not cycle. So not only do you have a ewe that has a uterine infection, you'll think she's pregnant. And about 40 so days later after the AI, all of a sudden, these females will start recycling. And you'll think, oh, wow, what happened? Well, most of the time, what happened is they had a uterine infection. So this is very important to manage this. And so especially if you start to collect your own bucks on your own farm, be cognizant of this. This would be a really bad thing. Certainly, we can damage the ejaculate, technically speaking, with cold shock, exposure to sunlight. UV light will kill the sperm. So the longer that we need this sperm to last and live, the less we can afford to have any damage to the ejaculate. So you need to know how to handle it, maintain temperatures, maintain sunlight, work quickly but efficiently, things like that. Another thing that we see sometimes is we get improper extension of the ejaculate. And so for some reason, there's this big desire that people think, more is better. Oh, more concentrated, more sperm, this is better. And we're going to get more pregnancies because of that. But in fact, that's not how that works typically. So what happens is these extenders that we're extending the semen in, they have a certain amount of nutrients and a certain amount of buffers to maintain the pH in that ejaculate while it's outside the body. And if we get the ratios wrong, if we have too many sperm with too few buffers and too few nutrients, then what happens is when that sperm arrives the next day and you look at it under a microscope, it's sluggish, it's stressed, it's slow to move. And so it can then obviously lead to lower pregnancy rates when we put that semen into the female. So it's important that, if you're trying to do this setup on your own flock to do this, that you learn this is what the appropriate level of extension is. This is what an appropriately diluted semen sample looks like. And most people are different, but they're running typically somewhere around 100 million sperm per milliliter of extender. So there are tools, machines available that can allow you to count that and mathematically get to that number. And then last but not least, something that's certainly out of our control are delivery issues, right? All of this is fixed time, right? We're pulling seeders with the expectation that we will be AIing at a certain time of the day. And obviously then the expectation that that semen is going to be sitting there when it's time. And I've heard, numerous horror stories from producers talking about their shipment didn't show up and things like that. And so from a risk management perspective, every producer has to have a plan B and maybe a plan C, depending upon how many females they have. Because if you're shipping via FedEx or UPS or whatever carrier you might have available in your area, there are no guarantees that that's going to show up. So just understand that that's a risk factor, and there better be, a plan B in place. So if your ram or buck doesn't jump to an AV, which is fairly common, then people ask me all the time, hey, can you use an electroejaculator? And the short answer is yes. Now, when you use an electroejaculator, the most common situations are, that your semen is a little more diluted because this probe is stimulating the accessory sex glands, which is where all the excess fluids come from. And so you often get a less concentrated ejaculate. Now, one of the ways that you can get around this or help to mitigate this is, even if your male won't jump on a female, if you can at least get them excited, trying to mount or interact with a female that you have in heat on that day, to get them excited, that often helps us get a better ejaculate using the AV. And it does that because the excitement, the arousal in that ram or buck initiates the release of a hormone called oxytocin. And that hormone is responsible for moving sperm up. And so the more arousal we get, the more sperm that male will move up for ejaculation. And so that's a nice little side benefit. The other risk factor when you are using electroejaculator is sometimes the male will pee in the ejaculate. And so the urine is gonna kill the sperm, especially if you're not paying attention and evaluating that sperm during the AI process. It might look okay for a little while, and then it's quickly gonna die. And so that's a real risk factor when you're using these electroejaculators. Now, and then of course, the last option is to use frozen semen. Now, this is where the sheep and goat worlds, from my experience in talking with producers, differs quite a lot. The sheep world has done a pretty good job over the last decade in getting some good industry standards. And there's a lot of good semen that's out there. Now, it's good semen. It's still not fresh, unfrozen semen, right? And that's something to understand. That's why it's a lower option. You're going to get lower pregnancy rates with frozen semen than fresh. You're going to get fewer embryos recovered per donor female with frozen semen than you are fresh. So if your objective is maximum numbers, then for sure go with fresh semen. If your objective is, I need this particular bloodline, I need this particular piece for my breeding program, then certainly frozen semen is a viable option. Just understand that it's not going to be as fruitful from a total numbers standpoint, but numbers is not necessarily everything. And below here on this slide is maybe one of the most important things to think about when we talk about frozen semen, right? And that's the lifespan of that sperm. I hear producers talk about all the time. Oh, so-and-so called this 60%. They called it 65, this is 70%, right? And they love to have a number out there. But when we're evaluating frozen semen, we have to remember, this is a one-time snapshot. We're looking at it at one moment in time. And it really doesn't matter a lot what it looks like at that moment. What matters is, what does it look like 6, 8, 10 hours from now when the ovum is going to be there and be ready to be fertilized? So if we just look at this example on these post-thaw survival curves, our time zero here is the evaluation under the microscope, right? And so you might think, okay, well, semen sample A and semen sample C are equal in their quality, and semen sample B is of lowest quality. But if we had the capability to pull that semen out of the uterus 6 or 8 hours from now, or the oviduct, hopefully it's reached there by now, we would see a very different story, wouldn't we? We would see that semen sample A and B are still quite good, and semen sample C, which started out very well, is now completely dead. And so the longer our curve, the longer the curve, the greater our pregnancy rates should be. And so we have to be careful with our one-time evaluation and putting too much stock in that one-time assessment of this is how that semen looks, because really it's how it looks over time that is the ultimate determining factor. And so I recommend to producers all the time, hey, if you're gonna get this semen sample, try to talk to somebody who's used it, right? What kind of pregnancy rates did they get on that sample, on that ram or that buck, right? Were those pregnancy rates acceptable? Because a lot of times they're not. Now, I was bragging on the sheep industry because the sheep industry has done a really good job of developing some standards and maintaining some standards. The goat industry is behind in this, in my opinion. And so we get a lot more questionable semen samples that are out there. And so, with frozen semen, it's a little bit of buyer beware, right? You have to do your homework and make sure that the semen that you're purchasing is worth the money that you're spending on it. Now, to have a successful AI program, you have to understand the timing of what's going on. And so what we're trying to do with an AI program is we're trying to put the semen into the uterus prior to the release of that egg from the follicle in the female. Why prior? Why does it have to be in there beforehand? Well, the sperm have to do two things before they can fertilize the oocyte or the egg. The first one is the sperm has to make it from the uterus up into the oviduct. So that's literally inches, 6 or 7 inches of distance that these microscopic sperm have to travel. And yes, there's some help from the female reproductive tract in that, but there is still the need to move, and that takes time. The second factor is the sperm have to undergo a process called capacitation. And this is a process that allows this, or is necessary for the sperm to be able to bind to the oocyte. So if the sperm has not undergone capacitation, even if it's in contact with the egg, it can't bind. And that capacitation process takes several hours. So we have to get the sperm in advance. We also have to understand that once the oocyte is released through ovulation, that it is immediately starting to die, right? Its lifespan is fixed. And we have, about 10 hours of good viability there for our oocyte. So we have to get the semen and the oocyte there at that time, or together when they're both viable. And so that's kind of what we look at here, the question of when do I AI? Okay, so if we know that ovulation in our sheep and goats is roughly 24 to 27 hours after the female comes into heat, if we AI too early, then a lot of our sperm are going to be dead by the time that the egg is available. So we would get a low fertilization rate. But the flip on that is the embryos that are produced would be very high quality because only the best of the best sperm could live that long. On the flip side, if we AI very close to the time of ovulation, then we're going to get a very high fertilization rate, but low embryo quality. So this is going to lead to lower pregnancy rates because the embryos are going to die. A higher percentage of them are going to die because they are low quality. And we know that embryo quality is a bigger determining factor in pregnancy establishment than fertilization. Now, that's because ultimately one of two things. If we inseminate late, there's either less selection for our good sperm, so you can get a mediocre sperm that's fertilizing the egg, or by the time the sperm make it to the egg is now old and it's of lower quality. So we try to find the sweet spot which is called the AI compromise. And this is our window, our ideal window of when we inseminate. And we know that if we're using fresh semen, that we can move our AI compromise time a little bit earlier because the semen's going to live longer and allow us to do a little bit more selecting for those more viable sperm. Whereas if we're using frozen semen, we have to move closer to the time of ovulation because better to have low embryo quality than no embryos because nothing got fertilized. So in the last bit of our talk, we'll talk a little bit about embryo transfer, which is the collection of embryos from an elite female, and then we transfer them into surrogate mothers. Again, with the goal of improving genetics or increasing genetics of a superior female. Although, don't forget, semen's still a big factor in this aspect as well. So superovulation, if you haven't heard, this is increasing the number of ovulations in that cycle. So the number of eggs that she's going to release. Now, how does it work? Okay, well, we're basically playing off of or trying to take advantage of a natural process that's occurring in these females. So females are born with all of the eggs that they will ever have. And every cycle, they go through rounds of recruitment where they say, okay, we're going to take these follicles and we're going to grow them. And then we're going to select the best one or two. And those are the ones that we want to ovulate to allow us to make offspring. Well, what we've figured out is that by hormonal injections of this hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, we can override the selection process. So now, instead of only one or two or maybe three of those follicles developing all the way until ovulation, we can get 7, 8, 9, 10 plus to do that by giving these hormone injections. And so here you can see an ovary of a cow that had been superovulated, and each one of these blister-like structures is a follicle, and they represent each one of those represents an ovum, a potential offspring, right? And so here are the ovaries of a sheep on day 6, which would be the day that we would expect to go in and collect our embryos. And so you can see that this ewe here responded quite well and has numerous potential embryos in the uterus for us to collect. So how do we do that? So it's a surgical process in our sheep and goats where you insert a catheter into the base of the uterine horn, inflate a balloon to block off the lumen, and then you go to the tip of the uterine horn here and inseminate fluid and basically wash the embryos out your catheter and ultimately collect them in a collection dish of some kind, and then evaluate them under a microscope, find them and evaluate their quality. So you can see here the embryos in this picture. There are some differences here. The differences represent two things. Okay, they represent the stage of development because these embryos are actively dividing the cells within them. So this embryo here, as example, that has this big hollow part, is actually just more advanced in its development than the ones that are more dense. And then you can also see the ones that are more uniform in their appearance versus the ones that are clumpier. And this difference signifies a quality difference. So that's the differences that we would actually care about, is a difference in quality between these two embryos. And here you can see, the relationship between that embryo quality that I was just referring to and the pregnancy rates. So we grade these embryos based on a standard that's been established by the International Embryo Transfer Society. And typically the IETS standard is a 3-grade standard. In this study that I'm just demonstrating here, they had a 4-grade standard, but typically we do 3 grades. And you can see that pregnancy rate goes down as embryo quality goes down. There are certain factors that cause decreases in embryo quality, including poor semen quality, poor nutrition, environmental stressors. All of those things can cause a decrease in embryo quality, which is then going to ultimately impact your survivability. Now, this is one of, and this data is in cattle, and this is a lot going on in this slide, but this is one of the challenges that producers face, particularly when they're just trying to develop their program. And it's the fact that in this situation here, 22% of the donors that had been superovulated gave 0 pregnancies. And another 11% only gave 1. Okay. And so all these things that we do, right? Everyone asks, oh, well, how many embryos could I expect to get? Well, depending upon your breed, or species, right? So sheep within breed, you probably say 6 to 7 transferable embryos per donor on average. And goats might be a little better than that, but that's the average. So one of the biggest risk factors is somebody said, hey, I want to flush 1 female or maybe 2. Well, if your female or 2 do really well, then congratulations. You hit the home run. That's wonderful. But you might also have the female that gives you 0. And so unfortunately, you have to understand that a little bit of this is a numbers game, right? That the more females that you can flush, the more likely you are to be average. And that's actually the goal, right? The goal is to actually be average. And so just understand that this process doesn't work in every female. And then once you identify females that it does work in, then you can up your average by continuing to flush those females and eliminating the females from your program that don't do well in an ET program. So I get asked all the time, and I'll kind of run through these fairly quickly for the sake of time. What does an ideal donor look like? And if I had to pick and quality didn't matter to me, right? I would say, 2 to 5 years of age. If we're talking about goats, they can be a little younger. You'd like them to have given birth once. You'd like them at a body condition score 2.5 and moving upward. This is actually a big problem I see in the industry. Is I think most people have their donors too fat. There's some data out there in the cattle world that highlight that as fat increases in your donor cows, that the number and quality of the embryos goes down. So we think about, in the old days, doing a nutritional flush, right? Where we flush them with energy just like 2 weeks before breeding, and that can increase our ovulation rate. And that works. And we can use that same advantage in our ET program. But that only works if your female starts at a lower body condition score so that she can feel the increase in that rise in energy. If she's already a 3.5 body condition score, then you can up the energy, but you're not going to get an increase in response because she's already too fat, right? So on the thinner end and moving up as we're starting our superovulation process. Genetics matter on this as well. So if you have females that have a prior history of superovulation success, they tend to do that repetitively. So if you have a female that, responds and stimulates, 12 or 14, it's unlikely that the next time she's going to give you 3, right? Unless she's ill or something like that. Those are frequently good responders, and those are the ones you'd want to keep in your program if they meet your quality requirements, right? And then lastly, and maybe more of an issue for me in my country, is keeping them cool and stress-free. Now, that's all well and good, but you have to understand these are just ideal, so could you flush a virgin yearling? Absolutely, of course. If that's what helps you advance your program, then that's fine. There's nothing biologically that says that you can't do that. Just understand, you have no history on her. You don't know. So the likelihood that she gives you a 0 goes up just a little bit, right? But I can't tell you, oh, don't do that. Ideal recips, just they need to be good moms, right? Good maternal ability, body condition score moving up. Some type of crossbred maternal breed is better. But certainly you can use your bottom end of your clubbier type females if you don't want to own a recip herd. Now, your pregnancy rates might suffer a little bit. That's fine if that fits better into your program, because then if they don't stick to your embryo, you can just turn in one of your cleanup rams and you can get a sellable offspring, right, that you can still market. Whereas if it's a hair sheep recip, what are you going to do? You're haul that lamb to the sale barn. That's what you've got. So it depends on what your objectives are. So how do you breed them? I get this a lot. Natural mating works as long as the male is of known fertility. You have to do a semen check before you use the male. You cannot just assume, oh yeah, he's rutting, he smells bad, yeah, he's fertile. No, you have to do the semen evaluation. In goats, we do a fair amount of splashing. So this is collecting the buck, slightly extending the semen sample, and then splashing the cervix with semen every 4 to 6 hours. And that works quite well in goats. Haven't seen that used a lot in sheep yet, and I don't know if that'll come or not. We'll see. Obviously, this is the cheapest, and it minimizes risk, and certainly less stressful, which might be helpful in our goat world because the goats tend to stress a little more than our sheep. If you can't do natural mating, or you have a bunch of females you want to breed to one male, then laparoscopic AI with that fresh semen is still the next ideal way. This will ensure that your semen's getting into the uterus, right? You've got a good technician, gets the semen in the uterus, and you can breed a lot of females to a single male. And if you're spending a lot of money on a jump and you want to maximize the value of that semen, then a great way to do that is to incorporate that jump of semen in with your ET program so that you generate that many more offspring. So your dollars per offspring continue to go down. And certainly, if you're trying to manage risk and things like that, certainly you can combine any of these options. If you don't have the males that you want to use or can't get a jump, then absolutely you can use frozen semen. The key is it has to be high quality. This is really essential because these donor females are going to have a lot of eggs to fertilize, and they're going to release them over a period of hours. And so your sperm need to live a long time. So you definitely need to have that high quality semen. And again, we can do this if we have sterile rams or bucks, crippled, deceased, or just quite frankly, you can't afford to get a jump. You don't have enough females. You're trying to start your program and you can't afford to buy a full jump or even a half a jump of semen, right? So there's definitely an application for this. Just understand that your total outputs are going to be a little bit lower. You're just not going to get quite as many embryos as you would with a fresh semen sample. Get asked this question a lot. Should I transfer singles or twins? And it's a good question. You tell me. It a lot depends on your environment. At my house, I live in the swamp down here in Texas, East Texas. I do not put in a twin. Everything is a single. Even a low quality embryo, I put in as a single. Because at the end of the day, our objective is marketable offspring, right? In my lambs, I want them to be blooming. I can't sell a lamb that's not blooming. And with my heat and humidity, I can't make blooming lambs very easily, certainly not if they're twins. And so where I'm at, what I'm doing in my house, my place, singles work. But I also have the ability to manage more recips. If you're limited on that, then twins may be the way to go. It's up to you. There's benefits, pros and cons, both ways. What do you expect? Right? Everybody expects the home run. But if everything's going well, good semen, average number of donors, so you get an average response, 3 to 4 live lambs, 4 to 5 live kids per donor. And, costs can vary a lot based on semen. That's a big factor. But just generally speaking, you're $200 to $300 per offspring in terms of the hormones and getting your technician veterinarian out there to do that procedure. And then you can splurge as much as you so choose on the semen side. So I started the talk with a slide about risk management, and I'm going to stop here on another sour note, right? Because for me, when I advise producers, I don't talk to them about how do we hit home runs. I talk to them about how do we avoid train wrecks, right? How do we ensure that your program is successful every time you try something, right? Because a lot of producers, especially if you're starting out, you can't afford the financial hit of it not working, right? So understand what you can control it, understand what your risk level is, and what the risk factors are. Again, semen, fresh versus frozen is a great example of this. So understand what those are and then implement accordingly. And also remember, you define success, right? Everybody loves the barn talk, right? Everybody wants to be able to brag, oh, I got this many embryos, or I got this pregnancy rate, or whatever. And everybody's looking for a silver bullet of, oh, well, try this, do this. If I fed this supplement, then I got this great pregnancy rate. And there's no silver bullets out there. There's no magic elixirs that are going to make these programs successful. We're still fighting biology. Do things the right way, control what you can control, and then understand that when you started the program, you had a set of goals. And if you're achieving your goals, then your program's a success, right? And those goals might be genetics over numbers. But if your goal is the other way around, if your goal is numbers over genetics, then you need to make decisions that help you attain those goals. So make it about you, make it about your program in your environment with your wallet, right? Your checkbook, and your genetics and how you can improve your program. And hopefully that will lead to success. So with that, I'll close and we can talk with Melinda and Chad, anyone else, answer some questions.
Thank you. That was a lot of information. We've got Carmen on today, and I think Chad's on as well, so we can all chat. But Carmen's going to take the lead on taking questions from the audience today. And thanks so much for joining us. That was wonderful.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Dr. Satterfield. I know in my own operation, we do have goats, and so we've done synchronization, but not AI. We just synchronize them to have a more uniform kidding season, kid size, that kind of stuff. So I'll have a few questions, but I'll get to some of our audience questions first. So the first one we have is, at what age can you flush a ewe lamb for the first time?
Great question. I get that a lot. So there's no set age that I can tell you. What I can tell you, because breeds matter, right? And when they attain puberty changes by breed and genetics. What I can tell you is that if you want to flush a ewe lamb, you have to get her to cycle once at least before you start your program. So you can do that artificially. You can do that using a seeder, making sure that she comes into heat using a seeder. You see that visual heat, and then you can start your flush program right after that. So as long as she's old enough that when you put in that first seeder, you can get her to cycle, she's old enough to flush.
Okay, I think that's pretty well answered. Okay, so the next question is, what is the success difference between implanting 2 embryos versus 1 embryo?
Well, that's a good question. So I'm a data guy, right? I'm a researcher first, And I will tell you that there's 2 studies that have ever been done that I can find where they actually asked that question. Okay. One of them is in goats, one of them is sheep. Neither one of those was done in the United States of America. And both of them are, I would call, questionable in terms of their science. One study said twins is better. One study said there was no difference. So like at the university with my sheep, I do all singles, but that's because I'm trying to study something very different. And at my house on my own sheep, I do all singles. And I get along great. I get a lot of pregnancies. But I tend to make that decision for me personally more based on my feed resources and my environment. So if there is a difference between singles and twins in terms of embryo survival, my estimation is there's maybe 3, 4, 5% difference, maybe, in what that would be. It's going to be minimal. So for me, I make my decisions based on the business side where I have better offspring to market, right? Bloomier, more uniform. That's where my decision gets made. But everyone has to make their own. But there's no data that says one way or the other that I'm aware of.
Okay. And then we have a couple questions on how successful embryo transfer is out of season versus in season. So how do you, if they're a seasonal breeder, I think that's the question. If they're a non-seasonal breeder breeding out of season.
That's a fantastic question. So it's kind of interesting, particularly on the goat side, at least down here in Texas. A lot of times we actually have more success with our embryo programs in out of season goats than we have in season goats. And the thought is that when they're out of season, we're not fighting their natural hormone production. Everything that they're getting, we're giving them in a very controlled manner. Because a lot of what we see in Texas, particularly this time of year, like right now, is the donors will start to regress. This a term, if you're familiar with flushing goats, you've heard this term. Oh, she regressed, right? What that means is her CLs started to die prematurely. Okay. So she stopped making progesterone. And that's bad for pregnancy, right? And so a lot of times we see more regression when we're in season because we're overloading them with hormones. We're overloading the system with their natural hormones plus the hormones we're giving them. And basically regression is kind of a fail-safe, like throw up your hands. Nope, don't want to do this. Let's start over type scenario. So that's a long-winded answer to say that in goats, for sure, out of season works wonderful. And on the sheep side, we haven't done as much because I'm down here more interacting with our Texas producers, and we don't do a lot of out of season flushing down here.
Okay, good. And then this question, I think I'll actually have some of our panel answer this. Sure. Between Melinda, Chad, and myself. What time of year is out of season in the Northwest? I would say where I am in Southern Idaho, things aren't really cycling from May, June, July, but we can get some cycles in August, at least where I am. So I'll see what Melinda and Chad have to say.
Yeah, I think that's in our sheep. August is about the time that they're starting. I usually don't even worry about mixing my ewes and rams until early August, but I have had 1 or 2 breed up in July. So, and then I've had 1 or 2 breed up in, February, March. So I think that's your window, kind of that August through March range when they're breeding.
Right.
Yeah, I would just echo that also. I think one more thing to think about though is we're starting to see more and more breeds that are fairly aseasonal or that can breed out of season. And, we have the polypays or a lot of different breeds of hair sheep, things like that. And even though there's still seasonality in our temperate climates, some of these sheep still breed up pretty well, what we would consider out of season. And so sure,
Right.
Dr. Satterfield has done a lot of stuff with that, or, I don't know.
Well, I do want to interject in one. I actually haven't done a lot with that, but I do want to
Okay.
interject one more point on this. So if you are trying to develop an out of season AI or ET program, right? Because I think of a program as multi-year, right? You have to build it over time. If you identify females of whatever breed that you have, if you identify females that do that successfully, lean into those females and stop working on the females that aren't performing, right? So take daughters out of donors that flushed out of season and flush them out of season again, right? And you're much more likely to do that because of the genetics, right? The genetics that are involved in that seasonality aspect. So even within a breed.
Great point. That was great.
Yep. Okay, so our next question, what is your experience reusing cedars?
Can I pun on that? I don't.
I
But y'all might.
know we will wash ours and use them up to 2 times. I don't know if you're supposed to do that or not. We've done it with cows, we've done it with goats. Anybody else have input there?
I honestly, I don't even use cedars in mine, so I can't say one way or the other. I'm still old fashioned. I breed the old way. I have rams on the property, so.
Well, the times that I've had experience utilizing cedars has mainly been based around research, right? And so we use those cedars to sync them up, and in some cases we use them just to sync them up prior to some, semen collection and some rams up in Montana. And they work really well, just as well as a lot of other, hormone plans that you would use. And I've found that they're fairly successful, although I've never used them on the commercial operation. And so, but starting out the season a little early or late, they seem to be pretty effective. So.
Okay. So the next question is kind of, how much training do you need to do embryo transfer, and do you think anyone can do it? So I guess, what is the training involved to learn that skill?
A lot. So, it is a surgical technique. And so you would have to either be a veterinarian, have a veterinarian on hand to oversee you, or you could do it on your own animals. So that one's quite complicated. That one is quite complicated on the ET side. There are more people trying to learn to do the laparoscopic AI on their own flocks, and there's some success there.
Okay. What do you think about the use of hormones in a limited way as opposed to the European Union? I don't know much about that, so. Okay.
I'm unfamiliar with what their regulations are.
Okay. How many recipients should be provided per donor?
So on sheep, they're fairly consistent. So I would say 4 to 5.
Okay.
So on the goat side, it becomes a lot more problematic or questionable, because just like the donors will regress and come out of the program, so do recips. And you can have days where literally half of the recips don't work. And so when you consider that your goats can stimulate more, give you more embryos, and then there's a greater likelihood that the recips don't work, you have to either be ready to freeze embryos, or you have to have a whole bunch of recips. So if you want to put the embryos in that day for sure, then probably 10 recips per donor. And if you can handle freezing them, then probably 7 or 8.
Good. Okay, it says using cooled semen, what is your recommended dosage every 4 to 6 hours?
So would that be splashing? Can we get some clarification on that one?
That's how I would interpret it, Dr. Satterfield, is the splashing technique maybe with goats. I know this producer has some goats and sheep.
Okay, so normally on the splashing, what we do down here in Texas is we take an ejaculate and we split it no more than 4 ways. So that's the maximum, is no more than 4 ways. So if you get a mil of ejaculate, you would add 3 mils of extender, and you could splash 4 does each with a mil. If you dilute any more than that, you're not going to get enough sperm to go through the cervix to get successful fertilization at enough of a number that it makes that technique viable. So minimal extending, and then, you know, normally, at least on donors, at least if you're breeding a donor with splashing, you know, the first insemination is usually about 6 hours after they come into heat, and you keep splashing them every 6 hours until they go out of heat.
Okay. And that kind of leads into another question we had. We had someone ask, if your doe is in standing heat, can you AI without hormones?
Certainly, absolutely. You know, obviously, if in that scenario, it would be much more like a cattle scenario where you would follow like an AM PM kind of rule. So the rule in cattle is, if you see your female in heat in the morning, then you AI her that afternoon. If you see her in heat in the afternoon, you AI her the next morning.
Yep.
And so absolutely the same thing could apply to natural AI in sheep or goats.
And I'll just say for the audience, in case they didn't see this, we did have someone with the cedar question. They mentioned NC State did a study on reusing them, and there was good success. Dr. Farron was the lead. So that kind of goes back a couple questions, but if anyone wants to look into that more, there's some more information. So another question was, is there an optimal protein level for you to be on after AI?
So the protein requirements for sheep and goats at this time are very low, very low. So you know, any feed that's over 12 to 14% protein is going to more than meet the needs for protein at this time. Really, we're much more energy dependent, and you can get much more advantage off of feeding energy. And so sometimes a lot of people want to feed fat because that's high in energy. That's good. But it's hard to get fat without the protein. So a lot of times I see, you know, people feeding these fat tubs that have 18, 20 something % protein, or feeding alfalfa hay, because up in y'all's country, y'all have that, and I'm jealous. So don't take offense to my jealousy, but yeah, protein requirements aren't really very high at that stage.
Okay, good to know. There's just a couple more on here. I think we'll just limit it to about 2 more questions. So we did have a question about sending sheep to a collection center for semen collection for export. What are some questions to ask the center about what they consider good quality frozen semen? How do I know I will get a good product in the end?
That's a great question. So from the export perspective, right, every country has their own export guidelines. And so I think the first thing that I would ask that company is, do they export, right? Whoever you send it to, are they familiar with export guidelines? Because that can be a lot of red tape outside of the biology. And then any reputable semen collection facility, they should be very forthcoming with the information that they get from their ejaculates. And if they're not forthcoming with the information, then that's a sign, right, that you should be skeptical, right? And what you would need to know is when they thawed the semen sample initially, so after they frozen it, right? Because what it is before they froze it really doesn't matter, right? So after they freeze it, at that moment, what's the percentage of live motile progressively moving cells? And then they should continue to evaluate that sample 3 hours, 6 hours, maybe even 9 hours after that initial thaw. And if they won't do that, then that's also a concern, right? And so what you want to know is that at that last time point, are there still viable sperm there, right? Now, they're going to live longer in the female than they will in a test tube,
Right.
because the female has good things in her uterus to support the sperm. But if they can't give you a number, that at 6 hours post thaw, at least 30% of the sperm are still alive, then if they can't give you that number, then they haven't done the appropriate quality controls. And I don't really have a number. Maybe I should come up with a number of what the minimum is, right? Every company should have a minimum standard, though, where if they don't have this percentage of live sperm at this hours post thaw, it fails our test, right? We're going to throw it away.
Yeah. No. Good to know. Okay, so this will be our last question. I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions that we had come through. So the question is, how many times could you flush a ewe in a year? And then kind of in addition to that, can the use of these artificial hormones cause any problems with their natural heat cycles and ability to become pregnant?
Great question. So the first question, how many times could you flush a female in a year? So it's fairly common. It's fairly common for producers to flush females at least twice a year. Okay. And you need at least 60 days in between those two flushes. That's fairly common. I have heard of some producers flushing 3 times a year, and I guess people are doing that. The most important thing that I would say, if that's your objective, is that you need to have your donor female fairly thin, on the thinner end, because the risk factor when you continue to do these surgeries is that you'll develop adhesions on the reproductive tract. So where fat will want to stick to the uterus, right? And every time you continue to flush them, you have to disrupt these adhesions to get the uterus back out of the reproductive tract or out of the body to flush it. And so every time you're creating trauma.
Right.
So a good technician can help to eliminate trauma, and then having females that are on the thinner side with less fat makes the technique better, more efficient, and will also have less trauma and less things for the uterus to adhere to. So probably have them thinner than you might like. And that'll compound, because you'll also get more embryos, because thinner females produce more embryos. It's one of the hardest things that producers don't seem to get. They want to look at fat, smooth, pretty donors, and that's actually anti to fertility.
Right.
The second part of that question.
Yep.
Can you remind me?
Can the use of the artificial hormones cause any issues with natural heat and their ability to become pregnant?
So it can. And actually, so like even in cattle where it's a non-surgical technique, we usually have producers that will flush at most 3 times, and then they'll breed the female, because they stop responding as well to those exogenous hormones. So getting them repregnant is critical to resetting the hormone pattern of that female. And certainly there are times where some of these donor females take longer, maybe than you would like, for them to rebreed. It is part of the process. And I would just say you can expect them to rebreed slower and keep going, even if you're past when you'd ideally like to breed, and get them to lamb or kid, because that will help kind of reset them hormonally.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yeah, there's a little bit of risk in that on the hormonal aspect, because we're given a lot of hormone. It's quite a lot.
Yeah. That's a lot to ask of them and their bodies.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering all the questions. We did have a couple of requests for some of the slide deck, and the slides will be up on our YouTube. But I think it was some of the specific, like you had like a supply list maybe, and some of those. So maybe if you have those, you could send them to Melinda and we could distribute those for those.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, for those attendees that want that, shoot me an email. My email address is ellison@uidaho.edu, which I can put in the chat box real quick. But yeah, if you have a request for those, reach out to me and we'll make sure you get a copy. And then we can get that set up. But for anybody who wants to review the material, it'll be on our YouTube channel, which is University of Idaho Extension Livestock channel. So.
And also, if anyone thinks of a question afterwards or whatnot, or I didn't get to your question, feel free to email me at csatterfield@tamu, that's TAMU .edu, and I'll be happy to answer any questions as well.
Okay, well, thank you again for your presentation and answering all the questions. We probably could have kept going, but I know we lose our audience after a little while. So, but thank you for presenting and all the great information. And yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk to you soon.